Hello again, and welcome. This is the last video on how to use stories um, to connect with an audience in the field of planning and evaluation. In the last two videos, we discussed why it is important to use stories, or how it can help evaluators and program developers to use stories to connect to an audience, to a larger audience, better than a technical report would. In the second one, we talked about the, the 6 characteristics that make up a good story. And we focused on the first one, right? The first of these characteristics is that stories, good stories, the ones that connect with the audience, are those that have a defined structure. And by defined structure, we mean having a structured beginning, middle, and end, where you have rising tension, a crisis, and a resolution. And also, we talked about the 7 basic plots of good stories, and we went in detail about these plots. We talked about overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. As long as you can tailor your story with any of these 7 plots, and we talked about what the characteristics of each of these plots are, people will connect to your stories. So on this one, I want to talk about the other characteristics of good stories, right? The first one we said was having a defined structure, but we have 5 more. They need to evoke emotion, they need to surprise the listener, they need to achieve narrative transportation, they need to leave some spaces, right, so that the listener can fill those spaces with their own imagination, and they have to have verisimilitude. So let's go over those in this one. So besides having a good structure, stories need to evoke some type of emotion, right, on the audience. So here you have a whole range of emotions that we can experience, right? Now, some research has been done on the field of emotions, suggesting that emotions that evoke some high arousal, like awe, anger, anxiety, are more likely to cause some action on listeners, rather than emotions that generate low arousal, like sadness, right? And we see this in social media, right? When you're going through Facebook, or I don't know, TikTok, or Instagram, whatever you use, when you look at stories that make you angry, that evokes some action in you, right? You want to click, or if they give you awe, you want to click that like, right, or comment on that. So the stories that make you have evoke high arousal, like anger, anxiety, or awe, those are kind of the ones that you want. But you got to be a little careful with it. And here are all the, when you're planning a story, you have to think about what type of emotion you would like to evoke on the listener, right? And here you have lots of emotions, right? From aggressiveness. Hopefully you don't want to evoke that. But here on the other side, you have awe and surprise, amazement, trust, acceptance, love, optimism, interest, joy, ecstasy. All of these emotions that are that evoke high arousal, and you have to think about them when you are planning a story. The third characteristic is that good stories surprise the listener. Yeah. Okay. So that doesn't mean to have like a mystery, or have a story full of twists and turns. Um, it could be finding a counter narrative, right? Something that you don't expect, right? Um, Usually, this can be using a counter narrative, which is a narrative that that it doesn't fit the mold. Like, for example, there is a master narrative of an issue. So if you have a story of a refugee that is, that breaks that mold of the common perception about what the master narrative is, you achieve this surprise, right? So good stories surprise the listener. That doesn't mean stories made up of, full of twists and turns, but it can mean finding example that sort of breaks the mold of the narrative for those stories, right? For example, if you're talking about a story of a client in your program, and pretty much all your clients, look all the same, but you have one that is kind of breaks the mold on that. Why not tell that story? That will surprise the listener a little more. So the other characteristic is that good stories achieve a narrative transportation. And I think so. This is this is where the storyteller makes a difference, right? When you're telling a story and you start describing things, and the listener starts imagining what the setting is, right? That means that they're being transported, right? They're having an emotional reaction, and in their minds they're playing this picture, right, of the story that you're telling them. And they're transported. They're not even thinking about what's happening around them at that point. They're in the story. You have achieved narrative transportation, and good storytellers do this, right? So they will, for example, make this elaborate description so that the listener is transported to this place where the storyteller wants them to go. And the fifth one is that some way to engage the listener is that good stories, they leave some room for this. They're not so full of details that the listener cannot fill in any blanks, right? When you want to engage somebody with a story, you have to leave some room for them to imagine or to fill in the gaps. For their imagination is immediately going to fill in the gaps, right? So when you say, I don't know, our hero met, the love of his life, or our heroine meets the love of her life, and the listener is filling in, the details of what happened in that encounter, right? When you leave some room, not too much, but when you leave spaces for the listener to fill in, you will get them, more engaged. The last one is that stories have some verisimilitude. This means that they have the appearance of being true or real, right? If it's something so fantastic that the listener cannot relate to in any way, right? Or the character or the situation, or the plot or anything, so it's not going to engage them. They need to need to look real, right, to have more impact. And the listener will connect to a deeper level if they can, if they can relate to it. The more real it seems, the more they will connect. For example, Star Wars has nothing real, right? I mean, it's in a different galaxy. It has, spaceships and laser guns and lightsabers. But what we connect to is the situations and the characters. They seem real, right? That situation. If I was in space, I would feel the same way. So it doesn't mean to be real in terms of everything, right? Your environment, but the situations and the characters. They have to have some very similitude. So what does this all mean to you in the field of planning and evaluation? Well, anyway, and to summarize, to increase awareness about your program or a problem, consider using stories, right? And these stories can be real life cases of clients or community members or program staff or the program founder or yourself even, right? And when you're working on a story, think about what makes a story great. And that's what we've discussed in this series of videos, right? Think about the structure, think about which plot you're going to use, and remember, there are only 7 plots that people connect to. Think about the arc, where the crisis, how the crisis is going to be. And effective stories can be extremely powerful, right? And they can grab the attention and heart of the public. So some organizations have been using stories from, especially, I mean, the most common way to use stories is client stories, right? And you have these clients, they're interviewed and they're telling the story of how they started. And there are some very interesting stories out there, very powerful, and they're have been very successful at communicating what the program does, right? When you have stories, for example, of substance use disorder treatments, where you have stories where the plot is this rebirth. Remember the rebirth plot, where our character, the hero of our story, which is a client, was in this state, right? And then they so where they ended up in this state of darkness, right, during their addiction years. But then somebody came and helped them, and they turned around, they overcame this darkness, and they grew and emerged from that dark state as a different individual, and the life looks bright after that, right? So these stories, they connect with people through that rebirth plot, and without telling anything about the program, the listener is filling in what the program did for them. And that's very, very powerful, right? So when you're thinking about a story for your program or for your problem, to describe a problem, remember that there is a science out there on storytelling, and remember that stories are very, very powerful. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you soon.